Welcome back to all of you, and welcome to the new participants that may have joined only the afternoon session online. Really thrilled to resume this sixth roundtable on cities and regions for the SDGs. We had fascinating discussions this morning, launching three big reports carried out in cooperation with different German stakeholders, GIZ, BMZ, Engagement Global, and several states and municipalities on the first ever review on decentralized development cooperation in Germany, and the resulting global policy toolkit that we hope will be of great inspiration to other countries, be they DAC donor countries or not, and also launching a third major report on city-to-city partnerships to localize the Sustainable Development Goals, carried out in partnership with DG INTPA at the European Commission, and which provides the first ever comprehensive monitoring and evaluation framework to assess the extent to which these partnerships are not only effective, but also delivering the intended goals. So this was a first session that kept us very busy and that conveyed some of the overarching messages, and then a second session where we heard from very concrete experiences of different partner institutions, city and state-level representatives carrying out decentralized development cooperation and sharing not only their wisdom, but also sometimes their headaches. And I hope this was also inspiring to many of you. Before we moved to the second session that Stefano moderated just before the lunch break, and that also provided very valuable insights on DDC going forward. Now, the afternoon is very much focused on the SDGs, both in this inward and outward function. We're going to discuss the extent to which we've made progress or not. This morning's second session showed to what extent major disruptions that we've been facing from COVID-19 onwards, and recently the war over Ukraine have somehow detracted the attention or the focus of policymakers on this long term, which is no longer long term, I have to say, goal setting and universal agenda. This afternoon is very much about, on the one hand, taking stock of where we stand vis-à-vis SDG 11 in particular, which, as you know, is devoted to cities and communities, and that by definition speaks to the heart of many local and regional governments gathered in this room and who are also online. We'll hear from our colleague from UN Habitat where we stand on the SDG 11 review, given this is the year that this goal in particular is under scrutiny and review as part of the high-level political forum, and there's a big milestone in July in New York whereby we'll take stock and see where countries stand vis-à-vis that goal in particular, and how much distance, equally important, they have to travel to reach some of the end values. So that'll keep us busy for the first part of the afternoon, where we'll hear after the overall status or progress on SDG 11 insights from different experts and stakeholders around this table. And thank you very much for joining us. And then we'll have a deep dive on a specific SDG 2 in relation to food security and the role of cities for sustainable food systems. We try for each of the roundtables to provide such a sectoral perspective, also to get more concrete and dive into the black box of selected goals where we believe local and regional governments have a key role to play. It's my understanding that our first speaker is delayed, but because we have very adaptive and agile leaders around this table, we've all agreed to swap the order and to turn the keynote into the final discussant. So Shipra will have the challenge to summarize the conversation she will not have listened to unless we are able to make a summary. But I suggest with no further ado, so that we don't lose too much time, because we have a very packed agenda until 5 p.m., that maybe we start with the panel. And I'm really thrilled and delighted to introduce our first panelist, the mayor of Braga, Ricardo Rio, a big champion of the SDG. I think Ricardo doesn't need to be introduced anymore, especially in this room, given his role within the EU Committee of the Regions. But I have to say also at the OECD as a champion mayor for inclusive growth, eminent member of the steering group of that coalition that is making the fight against all forms of inequality a top priority. Really thrilled to be working with Ricardo. You have the floor to tell us a bit how you see the evolution of SDG 11 in your city, your country, but also this EU setting where you've been playing an active role. Are you optimistic? Are you concerned? A bit of both. Tell us what you think.
A bit of both. Well, thank you, Aziza, and obviously we look forward for Ms. Suri's presentation. Greetings to all the participants and to the members of the panel. As you said, I am the mayor of the city of Braga since 2013, and almost since the beginning of my first term, I always try to use the SDGs as an important tool in the management of my city, not only because of the goals themselves, but also because of the tool. Because I think that to have something that allows us to monitor, to assess how we are progressing and how we need to develop more initiatives in order to fulfill each of the goals, it's something very important. And as you mentioned, I also belong to the champion mayors for inclusive growth, and that idea of inclusive growth is also implicated in this integrated approach that the SDGs allow, because we are dealing with several dimensions of the management of the territory at the same time and not addressing just one on its own. And therefore, we have engaged in a couple of networks locally that allow us to monitor our SDGs fulfillment. We have specifically a very important project in Portugal, which is connected with the Catholic University, the CESOP Local, which provides to a couple of cities an annual report of sustainability with over 100 indicators that are measured for each of the areas of the SDGs. And we have our own sustainability report in Braga from a couple of years now. And we have been trying to raise awareness in our community to participate in spreading the word in many other networks. We have here the city of Tallinn, which has been the leader of a very important URBACT project in trying to foster the use of these global goals in European cities. And we have been also trying to bring more and more the SDGs to the budgetary process of the city, so that we can link more and more the investments that we make with the goals that we are going to pursue. And I am also a member of the Committee of the Regions, and I have to say that early on when the Agenda 2030 was adopted, the European Committee of the Regions started to think about its role as an EU institution to support the implementation of SDGs. The European Committee of the Regions is an advisory body, but it is also the voice of cities and regions in the EU. It contributes in two ways to the SDGs, and more specifically to SDG 11. First, by advising the European Commission on how to tailor policies and funds, notably cohesion ones, to encourage SDGs localization. And second, by promoting SDGs localization among our pool of locally elected members, and even beyond to local and regional representatives present in Brussels. Just in the latest years, I was the rapporteur of two opinions approved by the core plenary that were supported in a wide consultation of stakeholders, but that clearly express our role in the establishment of interinstitutional partnerships towards the fulfillment of the goals, in the proposal of a stronger political commitment at the EU level, and in the showcasing of cities and regions' best practices all over Europe. There are ups and downs, as we have heard here today already, but today we can say that SDGs are widely known among cities and regions of the EU, and the surveys that the OECD has been developing are a great evidence of that. The map that was presented this morning, featuring regions and cities working on SDGs in the EU, says it all. It shows that many regions and cities are embarked in the implementation of SDGs, even in the difficult crisis contexts that we have been through. And that's a very important remark that I would like to make, is that even through this period of difficulties at the economic, at the sanitary, at the energy level, most of the cities are more and more implicated in the use of the SDGs, and I think that's a good example that we should have at the national and European level as well. When you look at Poland, Spain, Italy, my country, Portugal, the Netherlands and Belgium, results are very positive. Also seeing the sheer increase of subnational voluntary reviews, we can be proud of our actions. With this map, the Committee of the Regions wants to make a statement about SDG 11. Cities and regions are fully on board on SDGs. The committee also worked with leading regions and cities on SDGs. They are truly champions, with regions such as Basque Country, which has intervened already today, drafting the sixth voluntary review and being a pioneer in issuing sustainability bonds. I could also quote North Rhine-Westphalia, which was mentioned today, and Flanders, but I will not do justice to the work of other regions. Cities are also well engaged on SDGs, Braga, my city, Tallinn, Espoo, Bonn, Strasbourg, and many, many more all across Europe. The European Committee of the Regions is here to support us and convey our achievements to the EU institutions, and because our efforts need to be integrated in the EU policies, funding opportunities must be designed according to our needs for sustainability. And this is why policy alignment between levels of government is so important, and this is one of the key roles of the committee. As an EU institution, it is very attached to the EU interinstitutional dialogue, to have SDGs localization in the EU voluntary review, to have the EU SDGs monitoring, including regional data, and to better harness SDGs to the EU recovery process. With the support of the OECD and SDSN, the committee also produces fresh data on SDGs, and this feeds in the EU dialogue on SDGs. We work with Eurocities, with CMR, with Regions 4, to organize yearly stock-taking events and facilitate the exchange of experiences. And this is, of course, a long road. The EU sphere is very complex, but alignment of the EU level with our engagement on SDGs is really necessary to implement the SDGs. And this is why we are in constant dialogue with the European Commission as well. And I am very pleased personally that Laia is here today. It shows again a willingness to empower us on SDGs, and I'm looking forward to further collaboration on this ahead of the high-level political forum. An event with all these EU institutions presenting the EU voluntary review will be very positive in terms of inclusive governance, and I hope we can talk more about that very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo Rio, Mayor of the city of Braga in Portugal. A very insightful intervention to show actually the learning curve that we've been following from the very early days of the SDGs in terms of local and regional engagement. I have to say we have maybe reached somehow a level of maturity today that has been built over time, and I think institutions, as you rightly said, as the Committee of the Regions hosting us today, have been really big champions to unlock that potential. But I also liked your point about using SDGs as a tool rather than as an end per se. I think this is very consistent with what we've been calling for. You know, this is not a compliance agenda for local and regional governments. It's actually a compliance agenda for national governments, but there is potential for local and regional governments to use it as a means to the end, the means being to shape, you know, policies, allocate budget, prioritize investment, engage citizens, increase transparency, as you rightly said, to the end, which is improving well-being at the very local scale. So I think this is a very spot-on way of raising further the awareness of local and regional governments, and we'll hear from a few more in a minute. It's my understanding Shipra has joined, so I'm just saying hi, Shipra, informing you that we've swapped the order, that we turned you from a keynote to a closing note or discussant, or call it the way you want. And it's really great. You can actually be hearing what our panelists will say, and I'll give you the floor after, before we open for discussion. Let me now turn to our second panelist, and a pleasure to welcome Laia Pinos Matero, who's the Deputy Head of Unit within the Secretariat General of the European Commission. We heard a lot of things this morning about EU voluntary review and how the Commission is supporting also this potential to document more what regions and cities are doing, where they stand, and to unlock that potential. So really eager to hear from you, Laia. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Aziza. Many thanks for the organization of this meeting and the possibility that you are giving to the Commission to also explain what is the state of play of the preparations for the first ever European Union voluntary review. But before starting with and explaining what it is the state of play of these preparations, and that will be mainly the focus of my intervention, I would like to say that from the Commission, we are very much aware about the important role of the local and regional authorities for the implementation of the SDGs. And we know that an increasing number of cities and regions have already placed the SDGs at the heart of their core strategies. Cities and regions, and that is something that has been shown during today's discussions, for us are really the ones that could come with realistic and effective policies that they respond to their realities and implement the SDGs. I have to say that yesterday I had a meeting with one regional authority. I'm not going to say which one because I know that all of you are doing plenty of things, but I was really impressed about the work performed at their level and also the extraordinary effort that they are doing in order to make the SDGs a reality for the citizens and not something abstract. I read some time ago, but probably Stefano will have other numbers, that at least 65% of the global targets would not be reached if local and regional authorities are not fully engaged in this agenda. And that's something that it is very clear for us. As said at the beginning, I will focus the presentation now on why we are presenting this European Union voluntary review. But I would like to go a little bit some years ago, and I saw that there is also a participant from the UN DESA. I was seconded in UN, and I had plenty of discussions with people about SDGs, and they were saying, yes, the European Union and Europeans, you are doing a lot of things, but why you are not communicating better what you are doing? Why you are not showing to the rest of the world what you are able to do? And then in 2020, we published a staff working document explaining how the current Commission wanted to implement the SDGs. And we put the idea, just like tentatively, to say, okay, we think that probably we are ready to present a first voluntary review. And we think that in view of the SDG summit that will take place in 2023, that could be a good idea. And then we saw that there was a broad consensus that it was a good idea. Then, of course, we have people like Mr. Rio that pushed also in several times in this direction about the necessity that we show better what we were doing, the Committee of the Regions, but also other authorities, local, regional, etc. And it's like this that we have arrived to the point that we are preparing the first ever voluntary review. We think that the main message that we want to pass is that the European Union is committed to the implementation of the 2030 agenda, and that we have also had a learning process, if you want, but that we have now placed sustainable development at the heart of our policy making, and that we are making efforts to advance the 2030 agenda, both internally and externally, because that was also another of the lessons that we learned. For several years, we were passing the message that the SDGs were very important internationally, but we were not explaining how we, member states and regions and cities, we were implementing the SDGs. And that is for that also that it was decided at a certain moment of time that the Secretary General of the Commission should lead the coordination of the implementation of the Agenda 2030. In the high-level political forum of this year, so we want to present this first voluntary review, and we think that it will give us the opportunity to reaffirm the EU commitment, to increase the visibility and consistency of the European Union work, and also all the things that we have already undertaken, and to support, in a crucial moment, the importance of this shared agenda, because we have not to forget that, and that is something also that a colleague from the UN told me recently, if we had to negotiate a new agenda now, probably the situation will be much more challenging than in 2015. We also know that it's important that we communicate the things that we are doing well, but probably the things that we have not advanced as we were expecting. And the idea is to try to have a document that is accessible to the wider public, not only between us, I mean, something that it could be understood between the different levels of government, but to the wider public, and that sends a strong message to the world that the European Union wants to play a leadership role regarding the implementation of the SDGs. It is a document that tries to be honest, evidence-based, and data-driven. And we are not going to shy away from presenting the challenges that the European Union confronts, as well as the indicators that are lagging behind. We are very well aware, all of us, which are the areas where the European Union should step up their efforts. And according to the most recent data that we have received from Eurostat, we have made progress across a majority of SDGs since the adoption of the agenda, but there have been moments where the things have not been like this, and recent events like the COVID, but also the energy crisis resulting from the Russia's war of aggression have further complicated the progress. More progress is needed on some of the SDGs, in particular related to the ones on protection and sustainable use of natural resources. And across the world framework, particular attention needs also to be paid to impacts on persons in vulnerable situations. The European Union voluntary review will reflect the Commission's commitment to implement the SDGs at EU level through its 6 headlines ambitions and its comprehensive world of government approach. I'm not going to explain again this world government approach, but we can discuss it afterwards if it's necessary. I would like also to underline that this voluntary review has been the result of an active interaction with the different stakeholders. It has been crucial, the fact that we also launched a call for evidence, from which we received a substantial number of replies, and from which also we received replies from the UN, the Economic and Social Committee, and that it has helped us also to decide about the structure of this document. At the institutional level, of course, we have also pursued our engagement with member states through the Working Party 2030 agenda. And we also had different meetings with the European Parliament. And as I said, we had different meetings with the Committee of the Regions, in particular regarding the importance of giving a clear message about the important role of the local and regional authorities. I can say that we have tried to put these messages in the document, and we are acknowledging about what is also happening at local and regional level. All these things will be well reflected in one of the parts of this voluntary review that it's called synopsis report. And then just to say about the structure, we have a communication that it's like 25 pages that summarizes the main messages of this voluntary review, and there are several annexes. There is one annex that analyzes the state of play per SDG, and here we look at the internal, external dimension, but we also try to put examples at local and regional level, and we explain also which are the means of implementation. Then there is also a statistical annex. There is also, as I have said, a synopsis report, and also a document that explains how youth is also engaging on the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Now, just 5 more minutes, just to give some details. One? Okay, only one. Just to give some details, we have also about the preparations of the HLPF, because for once we have really been very efficient, and we have already a clear picture about how we are going to prepare the actual delivery of the European Union voluntary review. I'm happy to say that there will be 2 commissioners presenting this voluntary review in the HLPF in July. There will be Commissioner Gentiloni that will cover mostly the internal part, and Urpilainen that will cover the external part. This presentation, we are aiming to make this presentation on the 19th of July, and we are also going to organize an European Union site event where we want to give the voice also to the different stakeholders, Committee of the Regions, European Social Committee, European Parliament. So we are organizing at this moment this site event. We are convinced that the presentation of the voluntary review will be an important milestone for the SDGs monitoring and reporting process, and will give a strong signal that the HLPF remains the central coordination body for the global implementation of the 2030 agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laia. Sorry, this is fascinating and very interesting, but I have a difficult job as a moderator. I have to keep you all on time. That's not easy. That's not easy, especially when you say very interesting things. Thank you very much, Laia Pinos-Mataro, Deputy Head of Unit within the Secretariat General of the European Commission. I think 2 of the main takeaways from your intervention that I think hold particular relevance when we talk about SDG 11 are maybe the need to speed up efforts at EU level on this protection of natural resources. Actually, the joint report that we produced with SDSN shows that on 13% of the targets, I think the European Union is going backwards. So it's true, we've made a lot of progress on many of the targets, but we're also lagging behind, if not getting worse on some of the targets. And I think this is indeed one of them. And the second one I take is the reference you made to inequality and vulnerable people. I really think this is a social bomb, not only within the EU, but in many OECD countries. I mean, when you see you have almost 10 million poor people in France these days, I mean, it's not nothing for politicians. And definitely this hidden part of the leaving no one behind agenda is something that we need to put back into the spotlight, maybe. So thank you for this. And let me now turn to our third panelist, Rina Jusila, who is Sustainable Development Officer within the Division for Sustainable Development Goals, a full division on SDGs. We envy you. Tell us more about that in UNDESA. You have the floor, Rina.
Thank you so much, Aziza, and many thanks, of course, to OECD for having us in this important event. It's really heartening to see all the grassroots work being done on the SDGs, and also we're very excited about the European Union's voluntary review, of course. So thanks for having us. I think that it's clear everyone has stressed how pivotal a year this is for the SDGs. We were off track already before the pandemic in many of the goals. We still are. But at the same time, of course, we have this great opportunity to hopefully gather the momentum now running up to the SDG summit to really make a change. Mr. Markkula was talking about the gamble we have this year. So at least at the Secretariat, we're very eager to increase the odds that we have for success. So we're working hard on that. Our department is the Secretariat for both the HLPF in July and also for the SDG Summit, so we're preparing both of the events, and we agreed with Stefano that I would talk a little bit more on the process, since Shipra hopefully later on will talk about the actual substance on SDG 11. We really see the July HLPF as the preparatory meeting for the SDG Summit, so I'll first tackle a few of the issues on the HLPF, and then I'll move on to the SDG Summit. I would just start with the observation that, at least in our point of view, I think that there's a lot more focus on the local government, local level, local and regional government's role in the SDGs now at the UN headquarters, probably more than ever. So rest assured, kind of the lobbying and the communication efforts that many colleagues in this room have made are really bearing fruit. Yes. So in July, for example, at the HLPF, we have actually not one, but two sessions focusing on cities. So we have the SDG 11 review session, but we also have another official session titled Transformation from the Ground Up, Acting at Local Level. And the program is every year extremely packed, so I think it's really a testament of the member states' enthusiasm for this topic that there's two sessions. I know that there was a lot of haggling for the spots, and the local level session is there. And in addition to the official sessions, there's of course a plethora of other special events. So we'll be organizing the Local and Regional Governments Forum, which is a special event that we organize together with the UN Habitat, UNDP, and Global Task Force. So that will be taking place later on the same day. We know that the Local 2030 Initiative is organizing a half-a-day special session. Shipra will for sure talk about the voluntary VSR and VLR days that UN Habitat will be organizing. And we'll most likely also have a dedicated voluntary national review lab that focuses on how these VNRs are taking the VLRs and local level into consideration. So in that sense, excited to also hear if the EU review will be having a local element. We obviously will have a number of side events also on local level. So rest assured, local level will be addressed at the HLPF. Just wanted to say also that it's not only, I keep talking about these 8 days, but we of course have a preparatory process for the SDG 11 review. So we were very grateful to City of Bilbao and the Basque government for hosting our expert group meeting in February that we organized together with UN Habitat and UNDP. Thanks to also OECD for being there. And there we also wanted to make sure that we don't treat SDG 11 just as a single goal. We had a lot of colleagues from different communities. So we had colleagues from water, climate change, energy, transport, industrialization, for example, to discuss these linkages between SDG 11. So I think that's something that we hold dear, that please, if you are interested in coming to HLPF, also make sure that your different colleagues from different sectors are present or at least aware and feed into the conversations. So, as I mentioned, we're keen on ensuring that HLPF in July is not a separate event from the September summit. The Secretary General himself is very engaged in the SDG summit preparations. He has called for a rescue plan for people and planet. And he has requested deliverables, especially on 3 key points. First, the Secretary General has indicated that we must do better for supporting developing countries on SDG implementation, including better delivery of SDG stimulus and reform of the international financial architecture. Second, he has called for every single country to come to the SDG summit with a national commitment, especially on poverty and inequality, as Aziza mentioned, alarming numbers on inequalities rising in many places. And third, which is of course relevant especially for our community here, he has called for deeper engagement with relevant national stakeholders and strong communications in advance of the summit, and we have a dedicated track on local governments. There will be a political declaration that is facilitated by Qatar and Ireland this year. As a previous speaker said, the political climate for negotiations isn't particularly easy. I think it's very, very open for everyone, that everyone knows. But the facilitators have already engaged with the member states to hear what they would like to see in the political declaration, and they will be making the so-called zero draft, the first draft of the declaration, available in May. So looking forward to it probably in the next few weeks. They have wanted to wait for the special edition of the Secretary General's SDG Progress Report, which is a report that we produce on where exactly are we on the SDGs, and that should be made available next week. So that's something that the member states are waiting to hear from. Before I start wrapping up, I wanted to highlight another input that feeds into the SDG summit, which is the Global Sustainable Development Report that will be officially launched at the SDG summit. An advanced version is already available, and I would really recommend for everyone listening to take a look at the Global Sustainable Development Report, because it has a urban and peri-urban development as one of the 6 entry points for transformation. So it's very much highlighted that this is an area that we all should be looking more into. As I mentioned, the SDG Summit will have a local track to mobilize the constituency in several ways. I know that colleagues are finalizing those plans, but most likely, for example, we will have a special event during the SDG Summit also, focusing on local and regional governments. There's a great working group that is working on this track together with the UN colleagues and UCLG, for example. So we'll hopefully be able to provide to more details for anyone interested in engaging in the SDG Summit then. But I would just like to conclude that certainly the efforts that local and regional governments are making they are really heard at the UN headquarters, and I hope that the constituency will also respond to this newfound openness at the headquarters also by more vigorous and more impactful SDG actions. So looking forward to seeing everyone at the SDG Summit. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rina Jusila, Sustainable Development Officer within the Division for Sustainable Development Goals at UN-DESA. Thank you for unpacking what may be perceived as a very complex process, the HLPF and the SDG Summit, but which, I have to say, in your words, looks very straightforward and very simple. So a lot of clarity out there, including on milestone deliveries, and for stressing indeed not only that the advocacy of the past decade seems to start paying off, at least in terms of local and regional governments being on the radar screen of the UN process yearly and in between, but also for flagging some of the thematic areas of priority and echoing this concern around vulnerability and inequality in terms of the expectations related to the commitments that countries will make during the summit. Thank you very much, Rina. And we'll now turn to our last speaker for the panel, and then maybe I'll take a few questions before we hand over to Shipra, and then we can have a few more questions at the end. It's been a lot of listening so far, so bear with us with an extra speaker or colleague from the OECD that I'll introduce in a second. And I'll, as in the morning, invite those of you in the room who wish to either ask a question or react to anything you've heard so far to signal yourself, raise your hand or your flag, so I take the attendance list. And those of you online, please use the Q&A item in the Zoom or the chat function, and we'll collect maybe 3-4 questions, have a little break, and then we'll go to the discussant/keynote. I put you back in the keynote mode, Shipra, so you see, it's excellent. So let me now introduce my colleague Marcos Diaz Ramirez, who's economist. We work in the same directorate at the OECD, and Marcos has been a great partner in this localization agenda of the SDGs. He has co-developed with Stefano and the team this localized indicator framework, amongst others, and most importantly, mainstreamed the SDGs data that we have across cities and regions in broader OECD data sets to make sure that every single piece of analytical work that we do going forward also features this systemic framework. And Marcos is precisely these days taking stock of what we can say from an OECD standpoint on SDG 11 and ahead of the high-level political forum session. So Marcos, you have the floor, and let me confirm that we can hear you well. Sounds great. Go ahead, and we can see the slides.
Thank you, Cesar. Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to just share with you the plans that we have at the OECD, particularly through the territorial approach to the SDGs, to support this review of SDG 11. But to do that, I would like to just quickly remind the work we have done, especially on the, let's say, monitoring pillar of the program. So to remind you where we are and what would be our next steps. So just as a reminder, as I already mentioned, we created this, what we call the OECD Localized Indicator Framework for SDGs, which has certain characteristics that I think are very important to highlight. The first one is that it's a localized framework in the sense that there was an analysis, a process of discussing and analyzing from the UN framework what targets and what indicators are very relevant to be measured at the subnational level. And also this relates to seeing the SDGs as an implementation tool, because that's where you have this reflection of what do you really need to measure. And then the second question is at what scale? Because there are considerations, for example, to put it simple, when we think about transport, performance of public transport, we might need to consider what we call a functional urban approach, especially when we talk about global agendas and when we want to see the progress of cities. We need to make sure that the cities are comparable and that they don't leave anyone behind. So you really consider all the people that lives in, let's say, in this functional urban area and not just the ones that live in the city center, for example. So we had this reflection on which indicators you need at the subnational level and what types of level. It could be administrative boundaries or the functional urban approach, which allows for international comparability. Then we, through our databases and through also research and unconventional new methods, we collected indicators to help us monitor or measure the distance towards the SDGs. We collected around more than 100 indicators, and we were allowed to say something in different SDGs for around 600 OECD regions and 600 large cities, well, cities of 250,000 people or more. And also we developed this methodology to measure the distance towards the SDGs. And also, we then had this reflection on the importance of communicating these results and this data. So we created this visualization tool. Maybe the next slide. You could see, I mean, I guess many of you already know this tool, but it helped us to see, to get a first overview of the performance of regions and cities towards the end values that we identify for regions and cities in the different SDGs. But then this tool has been very helpful, and it was co-created, co-designed with a group of stakeholders, which are the pilots of the territorial approach to the SDGs. And in general, we have used this tool to, I mean, two main things. The first one is, of course, it helps us to provide an overview of SDG trends in OECD regions and cities, and we can see that through different reports, such as the synthesis report on territorial approach to the SDGs, but also other OECD reports, such as regions and cities at a glance. In the next slide, I think you can see the links if you are interested in those reports. But also, we tested the tool with specific local and regional governments, the pilots that you can see in the bottom of the slide. And it was very helpful because it allows us to identify in a comparative way strengths of these regions and cities, and also challenges, which is key to set action plans and recommendations from the OECD part. So, but of course, this tool and this visualization platform was launched in 2020. So with data of 2019 or older, so you can imagine that we now need to keep working on the update and improvement of this tool. So can we go to the last slide, please? Well, this is not the last, but it's good to just highlight that another issue or challenge is that although we have around 100 indicators, these indicators allow us to cover only 60% of the targets that we identified as relevant. So we still huge work ahead to really fill the data gaps, and we're working towards that. And this leads me to the last slide, which is the next steps that we identify. We identify, let's say, 4 next steps that we will be working.
I think you're frozen, Marcos. Oof. Yeah, lost the Zoom connection. Maybe Lawrence, you take over and spell out the slides. Stefano, you want to do that? I can read if needed, but. No, he's frozen. The image is frozen. No, he's moving. Okay, so can we wait a second, maybe? Marcos, we don't hear you. He lost our connection, I think.
We lost our connection at the room. But it's ongoing. So online it's fine.
They hear him speaking.
Schools, hospitals in different types of areas, which relates to the idea of not only cities but also settlements. And we want to include some of these indicators to complement the framework. Then the third point is to track progress. In the first step in the first version of the tool, what we did is to look at the distance that we could observe in that point in time towards 2030 and values. But now we also want to talk about progress for the regions and the cities where this is possible, where we have good time series. And then finally, keep raising awareness, the communications, and then in particular, we know that although at national level we can assess SDG 11, in our framework we are always trying to talk about specific cities and regions. I mean, all the regions and cities beyond the national averages. So in general, I think our framework, one of its strengths is that it uses methodologies to define cities that are comparable. So in that sense, the OECD is going to try to contribute by assessing the progress in SDG 11 for, in some sense, comparable cities across the world, mainly OECD cities, for this step. And of course, keep the dissemination of the data to support SDG implementation through our database and visualization tools. But this, by the end of the year, should be, we are hoping to have the databases and the visualization tool updated. So that's all on my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Crystal clear, especially the last slide for the audience here, and the ambition to expand, track progress, update, and foster comparability. We had a conversation this morning on the risk of sometimes comparing apples with oranges when it comes to cities if we don't have a common agreed upon definition, which I think this degree of urbanization that was developed with the European Commission, but also UN Habitat, the World Bank, and a few other global organizations helps extensively with. Now, let us take a few questions. As I said earlier, we'll do a little pause here. And I give the floor first to Iklay around this table, right? You asked for the floor. Others in the room, signal yourself. And I think we have two questions online, which I will make explicit loud after we've heard from the first speaker. Go ahead, sir. And if you can introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Aziza. I'm Peter from Iklay. And I have a question for Ms. Mataro from the European Commission. There's no doubt that at the global level, the universal language of sustainability are the Sustainable Development Goals. But still we know that between the different goals, there is not just harmony, right? They sometimes are in conflict, and there are the spillover effects and so on. But at regional level, we have the European Green Deal. And it was presented as the moon landing in economic, social, and sustainable terms. But still, when I heard your presentation, I didn't hear any link to the European Green Deal. And as there is also efforts about localizing the European Green Deal in cities and efforts about localizing the Sustainable Development Goals, it appears as if there were two tracks, one on sustainability according to the SDGs and one about localizing the European Green Deal. So why is that? Why didn't you make a reference to the European Green Deal? And my second question would be, do you think after the elections in 2024, do you think there might be a European Green Deal 2.0 that, let's say, is then really implementing the SDGs? Because when I see the comparisons that are done already, you see that most of them, there is overlap, and they cover most of the SDGs already. Thank you.
Great. Laia, I'll take maybe an extra question or two. I'll give you time and then revert back to you. And we have a question online for Rina from UNDESA. Do discussions within DESA about the localization of the SDGs include some kind of consolidation, critical analysis, or comparison of voluntary reports?
Thank you so much, Aziza. That's a very good question. The local track doesn't necessarily have this mechanism. For the voluntary national reviews, we in DESA produce annually a VNR synthesis report, which brings together the lessons learned from all the VNRs of that year, and that report always includes a section on how the member states have dealt with localization in their VNRs. Unfortunately, we don't have a similar system for the VLRs, and that is, of course, a shame because so much work goes into these reports. One of the challenges we have is that there is no registration for the VLRs as such, so no single entity actually has all the VLRs and every VLR of the year. So that's something that maybe we should try to work on better, that we would have access to kind of the annual reports that come out. But I know that we, of course, draw on the VLRs in many of our knowledge products, and UCLG does work. UN Habitat does good work on synthesizing some of the lessons learned, and obviously other think tanks, OECD and IGSS and so on. So they do get used, but unfortunately we don't have a kind of a shared database in a systematic way, as we do have for the VNRs.
Very clear. Thank you very much. We'll take maybe a question for you, Marcos, and then I'll hand over to Laia to respond on the link to the Green Deal and both localization efforts. Marcos, there's a question on which unconventional sources were used and whether they were the same for all pilot regions and cities. Maybe you can take that one from the localized indicator framework. So I think you're on mute, Marcos, or maybe we can unmute you here.
Hello?
Now it's good. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, we call them unconventional in the sense that it doesn't come directly from the national statistical office or some official statistical body in the country. But sometimes it depends on the indicator, but many of those are come from grids. For example, satellite imagery now allows to see the change in, let's say, forest covering the land or the territory, or air pollution, or heat stress, or in cities what we call the heat island effects. These kind of sources that at the OECD we are working through our committees to produce indicators that can fill in these data gaps. But of course, we're also working towards methods in which we can make these processes more transparent. So the data, the indicators are validated, the methodology is replicable, and through this transparency, we can build trust. But many of these tools are already also, they come from UN agencies, or the FAO, etc. So it really, we need to think of, I would need to think of the indicator, specific of indicator. We have different type of tools, which normally is geolocalized data, satellite imagery. Those are the main ones.
Thank you very much. Laia, over to you.
So, thank you for the question. And I would like to say that I have, in a way, mentioned it, the European Green Deal, but probably not clearly enough. The question is that I have said that we are explaining how the structure of the voluntary review is based on the political guidelines of the current European Commission, because the political guidelines of the current Commission is our strategy to implement SDGs. And we have repeated several times that, for example, the first political priority or ambition or headline ambition, as we used to call it, is the Green Deal, and the Green Deal only covers and will help us to implement at least 12 SDGs. That is a little bit intellectual division, because we always say that all the SDGs are interlinked. But in a way, we wanted to show that what it is our political strategy, that are the political guidelines, help to implement all SDGs. On top of that, I would like to say that we have also put something else in this voluntary review that we are preparing, is that we have put together the priorities of the current Commission with the 5 Ps of the Agenda 2030. And at the end, you realize that we are talking about the same things. So, the 5 Ps of the Agenda 2030 are aligned with our priorities and all together help to the implementation of the SDGs. So, of course, that the European Green Deal has a clear role to play to help us to implement the SDGs. And I'm not going to enter more into the details about the SDG, about the European Green Deal, but I can say that I cannot say at this moment of time, if there will be a European Green Deal 2.0, because honestly, we are still delivering a lot of things, and we still have a lot of things in the pipeline. For us, the mandate is not over, and I know that the next panel is about food systems. We have a significant number of proposals that should come, and that should be, or we think that are essential in order to ensure food sustainability in the European Union.
Great, thank you very much, Laia. And we'll take a last question before I hand over to Shipra, and maybe I'll direct that question to you, Mayor, if you agree. A question that says there is increasing evidence of partnerships between urban and rural municipalities on a combination of win-win interventions such as food, renewable energy, connectivity, transport, climate, and so on, that are good entry points, these rural-urban partnerships, to localize the SDGs. If you have any insight, maybe from Braga or elsewhere in Portugal or within your core experience on whether that makes a difference.
It does. Actually, I will not even need to go beyond the borders of a city. Within the city of Braga, we have a vast urban area, but we also have a vast rural area where the primary activity is still less, and the conditions are obviously different. And so within a territory of a city, you have to balance these two dimensions. And On top of that, it is important, obviously, to establish connections with other cities. In the surroundings of Braga, in Portugal, we have a structure which is the intermunicipal communities, and we have 5 other cities that belong to Sim Cavado, in which Braga also pertains, which are more rural territories. And we have a lot of connections in all these dimensions that we try to bring together. And actually, the Sim Cavado as a structure has its own strategy for the SDGs. And so it's something that we can apply also in that context.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and many thanks to the panelists. Stay tuned. We may have a second round of questions, but before that, I would like now to call upon Shipra. Shipra, are you with us? Yes, you're with us. You're online. Wonderful. Shipra Narang Suri, who's Chief of Urban Practices Branch within UN Habitat. Really thrilled to have Shipra with us to give us a bit of flavor of the ongoing conversation around SDG 11 progress. We understand this is work in progress, and we're on the road to the HLPF, but anything you can disclose at this stage will be insightful and first-hand information for many of us. Shipra, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Aziza, and my huge apologies. You know, this is the thing of relying on technology. For some reason, the meeting was entered an hour late on my calendar. And therefore, from a keynote to a respondent, back to a keynote. But thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it worked well because I had the opportunity to listen and reflect on what was being said by all the panelists. It's great to see some familiar faces, some friends in the room, and to hear some of the common challenges and opportunities of the SDGs at this point, which I will also touch upon. Where to start, really, because A, it is work in progress, and B, because it is the reporting on SDG 11 goes beyond SDG 11 in a sense. There are so many interconnections to be made, as someone was just saying. And SDG 11 indicators and targets are not just relevant in and of themselves, but have much wider implications on the larger, the larger framework of Agenda 2030 and other global goals to be achieved. Indeed, one of the things that we have been rethinking or thinking about lately, again and again, looking at the data, is that, you know, in the world we live in an urban and predominantly urban world, the failure to achieve SDG 11, and we are not on a good track, and I will come to that, represents a really dangerous collective failure with adverse impacts on many other SDGs, including those related to health, education, livelihoods, income, climate, economic growth, innovation, etc. So this is really something that we have in the back of our minds as we do the data collection and the analysis on SDG 11. The second is that, and we've heard this from everybody in the room, that accelerating progress or breaking this vicious cycle, a downward spiral on SDG 11 and the other SDGs requires multi-level, multi-actor, multi-sectoral governance and responses. And it is not possible in the conventional siloed approaches or top-down approaches or investments that are made purely from sectoral perspectives. We have, of course, seen the enormous role that local and regional governments play, in this process, and we've heard more of that today. We've heard from European Union, we've heard from cities on how local governments are stepping up, either in partnership with national governments or in some cases, in filling the gap left by national governments, and both are quite important.
We're hearing you, Shipra.
There's a microphone open somewhere. I hear some feedback. Okay, it's fine. To continue, I think I think we must also finally acknowledge that a lot of the improvements in that we are seeing on some of the goals and targets, but also in the data, are a result of these collective efforts of everybody in the room on enhancing methodologies, on building capacities, but also through the focus on localization and the VLR's movement, which has been phenomenal in terms of the data collection and reporting, but also in terms of the push we need to achieve the SDGs. For the preparation of the report, we have tried very much from UN Habitat side to ensure an inclusive engagement process in the preparation of this report. The EGM in Bilbao that Rina mentioned was an attempt to take in inputs, data, information, ideas, strategies, all of those into the report. And we're grateful to have Stefano and others in UCLG and many others in the room. The report, as I said, is under preparation, but I'll try and share some key threads of analysis. I do feel that we need much more triangulation to answer some of the why questions. It's easy to say this is the state of affairs, but it's very important at this point, at midpoint, to ask ourselves why this is the state of affairs. Can we triangulate? And I'll give you an example of some of that triangulation in a minute. We have tried to look at some level of regional disaggregation of the data we have and compare regional trends. What is happening in Southern Asia? What is happening in Africa? What is happening in other parts of the world? Little bit to see, who is advancing and who is lagging behind and what the reasons could be. And finally, in this report, we have a lot of emphasis on because it is a midpoint, it comes at the midpoint of the Agenda 2030. What are the transformative shifts that will take us into the next phase until 2030? From incremental change to making a quantum leap in some ways, what are those triggers? What are those catalytic actions? What are those big things that we need to put in place? Let me go now to a few key findings, and I say a few because really there's a lot that is still under a lens of assessment or validation. But let me go to a few, and I want to unpack those few here. For example, when we talk about housing, the SDG 11 target 11.1 on access to adequate, safe, affordable housing, basic services, and upgrading of slums. And one of the indicators is what is the percentage or what is the proportion of urban population living in slums and informal settlements. And here, we do have absolute numbers. I think that's as of 2020. And again, this is all based on latest available data. Marcos was talking about the challenges on data. And we know that we have, something to the tune of 1.6 billion people living in inadequate housing. We have 1 billion people living in slums and informal settlements. And that number actually increased from the year 2000 to 2020, which is quite important because the absolute number increasing means that we are not, whatever we are doing is not helping to keep the problem in check. Another important one was the indicator on transport, 11.2.1 on access to public transport. And here it was very interesting that, it's not new, but it's important to disaggregate the data. Globally, only 52% of the urban population has convenient access to public transport. But low capacity systems account for the majority of global public transport modes, the matatus and the whatevers in Africa, for example. And the convenience and convenient access are obviously highest in Australia, New Zealand, North America, Europe, and lowest in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or Southern Asia, Central and Southern Asia. And these are trends and pointers that we hope that policymakers can look at and unpack in their own context and see what they can change and what are the shifts. Typically, averages hide more than they reveal, so this disaggregation is very important for us. Then there are indicators such as, around participation of civil society, 11.3.2 in urban planning and management. You don't have very strong quantitative data on this, but compiled from different sources, experts, reports, research, less than half of the cities have structures, sustained structure systems for civil society participation and in planning and management, and much fewer have a participation in budgetary and decision-making financial policies. Similarly, there is good data. There is some data being collected now on indicator 11.4.1 on the target 11.4.1 for the first time. There is much more data being collected on public and private investment in the preservation of cultural and natural heritage. But it's very clear that most investment is taking place from the national level rather than the local level. This is a sub-qualifier of that indicator. Where is the investment being made? On the issue of waste, air quality, I think we have some of the best data that we can talk about. The proportion of municipal solid waste collected and managed as a percentage of the total waste generated in cities. And again, we have an absolute number from 2018, 2.4 billion tons of municipal waste was generated, of which only 45%, less than 50% was managed properly. And municipalities, again, in sub-Saharan Africa continue to struggle much more than others in terms of municipal solid waste, transport, management, etc. And slum areas obviously have much lower rates of waste collection and transportation. Again, on air quality, similarly, good data. Good data also on public space. The only 45% of the global population has access to public space. And finally, I want to touch upon the indicator that OECD and us are concerned with collectively on the national urban policies, which is, we talk about indicator 11A, one number of countries that have national urban policies or regional development plans that respond to population dynamics, ensure balanced territorial development, and increase local fiscal space. Now, it's very interesting. We have the numbers of national urban policies. We have, out of 157 national urban policies available in 2020, 38% in development stages, 60% in implementation stages. But we don't have enough information. We have some on beyond the numbers, part B and part C, the quality of those national urban policies. How do we say they are ensuring balanced territorial development? How do we say they are increasing local fiscal space? The impact of those policies. So I think those are the types of gaps. Triangulation, I want to emphasize as a last point. There is some data points around air quality, for example, which are telling us that, air pollution is not just a big city problem. It is a problem growing in rural areas and, most importantly, in peri-urban areas and intermediary cities and towns. And I would love to be able to triangulate, for example, data from OECD or others work around economic activities in these areas. And what is the contributor? Why is it that peri-urban areas and intermediary cities are showing a sign of high levels of air pollution, for example? Is it due to poor planning? Is it due to the types of economic activities? Is it because green infrastructure investments are not reaching there, etc.? So the analysis is still in progress. We will be very happy to take more inputs into that analytical process. We would be very happy to engage in a conversation on the transformative shifts at the HLPF with all of you. And we would be very happy to, at the SDG Summit, talk about really what are the big actions that need to be taken in terms of multi-level governance. And I want to close on this point. The emphasis on localization is very important, but localization is not equivalent to local action alone or the abdication of national responsibility towards local action. It really is about joined up action from national to local in pursuit of the global. And that's what we hope to do to advance the SDGs 11 going forward. Thanks very much, Aziza. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Shipra. Thank you. Very enlightening. And that was first-hand information. We understand this is still ongoing work. I think the main point I'd like to stress from some of the early findings that you shared is that many of the areas that you spotted as being ongoing headaches and challenges to catch up with SDG 11 are actually happening to be also hot potatoes for advanced economies. I think everything you said around housing, when we see the extent to which affordability, the affordability of housing has become a really acute challenge for many mayors in OECD advanced economies, combined with the cost of living crisis that comes from rising energy prices and so on. When you talk about transport, where we see a discourse, that is aiming to reduce the dependency on cars, and that makes absolute sense in the post-pandemic city, but that often comes with the lack of credible alternatives in terms of serious investments in public transport to offer a broader menu of options. When you talk about public space, this morning there was a very interesting question asked about mental health and the extent to which local governments are taking that into consideration, how we're reclaiming at local level public space, I think is also very spot on. And I think that those kinds of data and worrisome trends where the situation is getting slightly worse in some parts of the world go beyond the traditional approach of cities' problems being just slums. I think this holistic, systemic, multi-sectoral examples that you provided are really extremely enlightening. So we look forward to the final numbers and to the HLPF session in July, and for the entire urban community to actually say loud and clear that we're not on track and that we need to speed up efforts on that front. So thank you, Shipra. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A just in case. Yes, so maybe a generic comment on the Q&A if you wish to have a look, and I don't see any flag up here. So if you all agree, given we are on time, I will close this session here. Maybe give the opportunity to those who are in the room to have 2 minutes to stretch, take a little break. It was not foreseen in the agenda, but I think just stretching a bit, and also because I know some of you have to catch a plane or a train around this table, so that helps us rearrange the setting. So let's take 2 minutes, 2 minutes sharp, and then we resume. For those of you that need a little break, many thanks to all the speakers for joining us in this third session. And online, please stay tuned. We'll be back in 2 minutes for the next session on food systems and the roles of cities.